What exactly is happening in this image? We have men laying face first on what looks like pizza paddles, with their canine overlords pinning them down. If you're from Tyres, France, or know a little history of cutlery, you know that these are the yellow bellies of Valet d'Usine. They are a significant part of the local town of Tyres' industrial history, and these rowdy gents are, believe it or not, sharpening blades. Today we're going to simplify the sharpening process for single bevel blades, not with any store-bought jigs or a paddle and a pooch, but with some very simple and basic ideas. The story of cutlery in the small town of Tyres is too good to let go. Fed by the Durolle River, water lapped at the paddles on water mills, turning turbines and creating energy that could be used for their forges as well as for the sharpening process. Giant spinning grinding stones lay on the floor, harnessing a little bit of that power, creating not only a motion for the grinds, but they also pulled water in from the river to keep the steel cool, much like our water grinding stones we use today. If steel gets too hot as the metal is ground down, the steel will lose its temper and the blade is useless. Having a cool body of water to both cool the blades as well as to turn the grinding stones was a godsend. The employees that work the grinding process might look like they're comfortable or that they're ready for massages, but it was a very difficult and dangerous job. Because of the pumping of cold water in from the Durolle River, besides being exposed to the splashes that came with the job, the workers were forced to endure cold, damp working conditions. This is where the lovable canines came in. Trained to remain stationary on their master's back legs, they were a source of heat as these workers ground steel. These working conditions persisted for hundreds of years, through the early 20th century. From literature that I've studied, manuals that I've read, even from instructors I've studied under, the complicated nature explained to sharpen blades has felt very much like Tyres, France, with the elaborate turbines and waterways that were used. But sharpening is not complicated. There's no mystery to getting a sharp edge. There are 3 things that are needed, and I promise you by the end of this video, you won't need any specialized sharpening tools to do this. The first thing that we need is an abrasive. Sharpening a blade is like sanding a piece of wood, but instead of getting a smooth piece of stock when we're done, we're aiming to get a polished edge on our steel. Same basic concept. Sharpening stones are traditionally used, but because of the cost, we're going to skip them. Besides the cost, there are some real problems that comes with them, like if you don't use a liquid of some kind, there's a condition called glazing that can occur. These stones are like giant sponges, and as you sharpen, debris falls off and is pushed into them. After doing this several times, you're left with a fine, dull surface that will need to be conditioned again. However, a bigger problem that comes with liquids is that the steel you grind down becomes a slurry of material that can actually damage the blade. This doesn't happen if you're constantly removing the liquid from the surface and replacing it with fresher, uncontaminated liquid. It can be done, but it's a big mess. Another problem that comes with sharpening with a sharpening stone is that the surface must be absolutely flat. So what's left? More in a little bit. The second thing needed is an angle. Single bevel blades, fortunately for us, are incredibly easy to sharpen. We don't need to get 2 angles to match in the middle. The angle we grind is only on one side. But as simple and obvious as this point is, there are some real important things we need to keep in mind. There isn't a one-size-fits-all angle for all chisels, although the average angle is about 25 degrees. If we change that angle to 20 degrees, we get a much sharper edge that works much better for delicate work. Herring chisels are thinner and perform better with detailed work, but the disadvantage to these chisels is that they are much more brittle. If you try to use them for mortises, you'll dull the blade much faster, and with a mallet, you risk chipping it. If we raise the angle above 25 degrees, there's an almost opposite effect. The blade will not be as sharp, which means it will take more force to make cuts. A mortise chisel, for example, is more resilient and less likely to chip due to that wider angle. But using a mortise chisel to do fine work is like using a chainsaw to do scroll work. Besides the bevel, we also need to condition the back edge. Even though we aren't grinding angles on both the front and back side of the blade to make a point, the bevel needs to be very precise. As we grind on the bevel, it creates a steel flap at the tip called a burr. Cleaning up the burr on the backside is the final part that leaves us with a very keen, sharp blade. Finally, we need to have the right technique. Even with the most expensive jigs and the most ideal tool steel, it really won't do much for us if we're not using the same refined process each time. Sharpening is a skill that must be mastered, but as I said earlier, it's not as difficult as it may seem. The process that I'm going to show you is based on the Scary Sharp system, but I have my own little twist on the end that makes my blades easier to keep and remain sharp. The easiest method to produce a sharp blade is without a jig. You don't need anything more than a piece of glass with a piece of sandpaper on it. You can get a very sharp chisel with a piece of glass bathroom tile you can buy for about $1 and a piece of sandpaper. I bought this pack of sandpaper for about $6 and it'll go a long way with my sharpening. The method to attaching sandpaper to glass is often called the scary sharp system, and it's as effective as it is straightforward. Now you might wonder why sandpaper is such a great tool for sharpening. The secret lies in something called friability. Friability refers to the ability of abrasive particles to fracture and expose new sharp edges. This ceramic tile is friable, breaking into smaller pieces each time it's hit. Not only are the pieces getting smaller, but each new point is sharp, which is why some sandpapers are called self-sharpening. Now let's talk about ceramic sandpaper. Just like the tile, ceramic sandpaper is made of abrasive particles that fracture and expose new, sharp edges as you use it. This means that as the sandpaper wears down, it doesn't lose its cutting power. Instead, it continues to sharpen your tools with precision. But here's the best part. The sandpaper not only keeps itself sharp, but as those particles break down and become finer, you naturally move through the sanding progression. Starting with 200 grit, you might end up with something closer to 400 or even 500 grit by the time you're done. This isn't just convenient, it's a real time saver. By using the same piece of sandpaper, you're not only maintaining that sharp edge, but you're also speeding up the entire sharpening process. In contrast, sharpening stones don't have the self-sharpening property. They're not friable. You'll start with a higher grit and need to put some elbow grease into it until you've cleaned up the blade enough to move on to an even higher grit. Because sharpening stones take more time and effort, some woodworkers turn to more aggressive methods like grinders to get their tools sharp quickly. But grinders, as we talked about earlier, can be risky. They generate heat that can damage the temper of your blades, and if you're not careful, you can remove too much material in a flash. The scary sharp method, on the other hand, is not only less labor intensive, but also safer for your tools. You can start with a coarser sandpaper and with just a couple strips, finish with a razor sharp edge without the risk of overheating or overgrinding. We've talked about abrasives with flat surfaces. We've talked about angles. Let's get right to the method. The materials needed are 2 pieces of glass tile and a paintbrush with part of the tip removed. And this is just so that I have a stiffer brush. The glass tiles you can find in any hardware store. I got these for maybe $1 a piece. One of my glass tiles will be used for lapping and any other work that I need to do on the bottom side. And this just includes removing the burr later on. The sandpaper grit that I'll use on this will always be 600 grit. It doesn't need to be any more or any less. With my second glass tile, this is where I'll do all of my sharpening. Before we get started, it's crucial to begin with a blade that's flat across the back. If yours is damaged or hasn't been lapped before, you'll need to flatten it until it's even. This is pretty basic for any kind of chisel sharpening though. In this demonstration, I'll be doing some work on a damaged blade. I will be starting off with 220 grit sandpaper because my blade is damaged. I'm gonna add my hot glue now, and that's to both pieces. So I've got my lapping block here and my 220 grit sandpaper here. I'm only using a drop. It really does not take that much. It's easy to get off later on once I put this on. With my sandpaper on here, I'll go ahead and start this, and you'll notice that I'm using really thin sheets. You don't wanna use something really big because these are very temporary. So I'll come in here now and put my bevel right on the sandpaper and start pulling back. Already you can see I've got a little bit of rust. I'll go ahead and clean this off. The sandpaper's friability will naturally wear down, and soon it'll be cutting more like 600 grit. It's important to remember to use the brush whenever you can to clean off the sandpaper, as pushing the chisel back into the dust that we've already sanded off can damage the blade. What we're looking for now is a burr that will form on the back side of the blade. Underneath the microscope, you can see a little bit of a catch on the flat side of the blade. It's not something that you need to look for, but you can feel it with your finger. Once you've found that, it's time to bring it back to the lapping plate, where we can clean it off. We'll keep working with the 220 grit sandpaper until it starts to feel like 600 grit. At that point, we can remove the 220 grit sandpaper and add our 600 grit. At this point, I've got a very sharp edge. It's so sharp that I can shave easily with it, going from something that's extremely rusty to being able to shave my arm hair. But I'm not quite done with it yet. Remember, what I've shown you here is the more aggressive version of this method. Unless you've chipped your blade, you won't need to start with 220 grit every time. For regular sharpening, I always start with 600 grit. Finally, I did say that a jig wasn't needed, and I stand behind that. However, if you need to change the angle on your chisel, or you'd like to add a micro bevel, or you'd really just like to make sure your blade is at the perfect angle as you sharpen, I created a jig that you can make to do that. The video is free and I have free plans on my website to make one. You'll see that video at the end of this video and in the description. The obvious benefit of using a jig is the consistent square angle it provides. Achieving a blade sharp enough to split a hair is difficult with freehand sharpening, but a jig makes that precision much easier. If you plan on using the one that I created, you'll want a large sheet of glass, as a jig needs to be on the same plane as the sandpaper. Another advantage to using the jig is that you can adjust the angle of the blade, but you need to keep in mind that changing the angle requires a much coarser grit sandpaper, and there will be a lot of work involved in cutting it down. At that point, using a bench grinder is probably your best bet. Next up, we have honing. The honing process helps to refine and maintain the edge. At this stage, we've likely brought the blade to around 1000 grit thanks to the friability of the 600 grit ceramic sandpaper. While you could continue refining the edge with higher grit sandpapers, this is where I stop. Generally, the next step is to move on to a leather strop, but I find that the process of leather stropping can hinder the sharpening process that I started. The reason for this, in my own experience, is that the leather can actually cause the point to roll. The leather is soft and any force put on it can move around the point. I like to stick with glass as it continues to give me that flat surface, and just like leather, I use a honing compound, except I like to use more of a paste. I used to rely on turmeric paste, but due to cost, I started experimenting with different materials, and I found a formula that works really well. To make my compound, I mix 1 part aluminum oxide, which I get from a rock polishing supplier, and 1 part light mineral oil. The oil is thin enough to use in a spray bottle, which is important because we want it to be a very thin liquid. Once mixed, I load it into a plunger for controlled use. This process uses the same principles as the Scary Sharp method. My third glass tile gives me a perfect reference for the tip of my blade. After applying a tiny amount of paste, I pull the chisel across the glass. As I continue, the paste turns gray, indicating it's removing material and sharpening the blade. Just like during sharpening, I use a lapping plate to clean up the back. With enough honing, this method sharpens well enough to cut a hair in half, even at a 30-degree bevel. For more information on both and the recipe, I'll have a link in the description. Don't worry though, my recipe is absolutely free. However you choose to sharpen your blades, I want to thank you for being here. This video was a pleasure to put together. I'd like to quickly thank my Patreon team that makes putting these videos together possible. Without them, I couldn't keep the website going, nor could I continue providing free plans. Do me a favor and thank them in the comments. If you'd like to be a patron, I've got a link in the description. Thank you. Michelle B, Keith Current, William L McNally, Rich Lightfoot, Tutor the Barbarian, Mike Lornitis, Les N, Gary G, Aubrey G, Nukebert, Sam W, Aaron Knows DIY, and Doug F. Hit the thumbs up, subscribe, and ring that bell. And I thank you so much for being a part of my shop. Please leave a comment below. Come find me on Instagram at Make Things with Rob. And remember to keep making things.